Welcome to DevNetwork's Developer Week webinar series. I'm Patrick Gallagher, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this week's featured webinar presented by Andela. Andela is a regular sponsor of Developer Week and is solving technical talent shortages by building distributed engineering teams with talented software engineers. Before we get started with speaker introductions, I'd like to remind our attendees that live chat and Q&A is available during the session, and you can raise your hand in the chat or ask questions in the Q&A section of the webinar viewer. The chat and the Q&A can be found on the right side of the viewer. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded and made available approximately 48 hours after the event for additional viewing. So you will be able to check it out again, or you can forward it on to your coworkers to check it out. So, joining us today as your presenters from Andela are Wambui, Kinya, VP Partner Engineering, Andela, James Tyack, Engineering Manager, Coursera, and Pervez, Soomar, Sales Director, Andela. So without further delay, please give your undivided attention to the Andela team. And first to kick it off is Pervez.
Awesome. Thanks so much, and welcome everyone to our best practices for onboarding remote engineers. I hope all of you are staying safe and healthy. As mentioned, my name is Pervez Soomar, and I'm one of the sales directors at Andela. So my role includes helping engineering leaders all around the world make decisions on how to scale their engineering teams effectively and to make sure they're set up for success. So the first part about this title really resonates with me right now. We're at a point where, this is likely our new normal for the foreseeable future. And so we need to be operating as such and finding ways to thrive within it. Some companies are already making thoughtful decisions, not only for near term, but for the longer term vision around operating in a remote structure. And onboarding is obviously a really key and important discussion when it comes to that. So some housekeeping tips before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please pop them into the chat, and we'll obviously have time at the end to answer those. If there is a question that we don't get to during that time, we'll follow up with you directly, hopefully within 24 hours. And then, of course, we'll also be, recording the session, so please be on the lookout for that. So let's dive right in. So meeting the panelists. So it's time to introduce the people that are actually going to be running the show. And so I'm thrilled to be sharing the stage with both James Tyack and Wambui, Kinya, who are both thought leaders within the remote engineering space. And we're excited to learn from both of you today. So let's jump right into some introductions. What I'm going to ask is, please give us your background and then also share with us your experience with remote onboarding of engineers. And so, James, let's start with you.
Thanks, Pervez. Hi, everyone. So I'm really excited to be here together with Wambui and Pervez today. I'm an engineering manager at Coursera. I'm based in San Jose, California. And for anyone that's not familiar with us, we provide high quality, low cost online courses, degrees, professional certificates, and lots more to learners right across the world. And our mission is to transform lives through learning. I lead the growth team. And prior to Coursera, I was actually an engineering manager at PagerDuty. I've worked in engineering for around 15 years, and most teams that I've led have spanned countries and continents. And I've had team members in Vietnam, India, Europe, South America, the US. And most recently, I'm working with the incredible Andela folks based in Africa, as well as team members in the US and Canada on the team. I've made mistakes during this journey. I've learned a lot along the way about what makes teams great, high-performing, and engaged. And I'm still learning, right? It's an ongoing process. And I've been remote from my team on a couple of occasions as well, completely remote. I've been the one who hasn't had a team around me. So on top of that, like most organizations, all my team in the office here in California are now remote. And I've welcomed and onboarded a number of new engineers since that happened. So thank you. Great to meet everyone.
Thanks, James. Wambui, how about you? Can we get an introduction from you as well?
Sure. Thanks, Pervez. Greetings from Kenya. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. As mentioned, my name is Wambui, Kinya. I've been at Andela 4 years and currently lead our partner engineering team, which is the function that ensures our engineers deliver when placed with global engineering teams as remote and embedded team members, and proudly have a few engineers that are on James's team. Prior to Andela, I spent over 15 years working and leading distributed delivery teams across 5 continents with companies such as ThoughtWorks, IBM, and Digitas. I truly believe I've seen it all, just given the years and how technology has evolved. But from having to fly to China with functional requirements just so I could kick off a team, to having to figure out how to get teams to understand each other on conference calls. Whether it's the American colleagues don't understand what the Chinese colleagues are saying and the Indian colleagues don't understand what I'm saying, and trying to figure out how we create forming and norming. So it's all been very exciting, and certainly how technology has evolved and our appreciation for what it means to have really effective teams has also evolved. I think how teams form and norm across time zones and locales is so important, and excited to discuss this today. Back to you, Pervez.
Awesome. Thanks, Wambui. So before we get started, why does good engineering onboarding matter? So, as we all know, onboarding is not easy, and it's a big investment from the entire team. And these investments can lead to some major long-term benefits as well when onboarding is done successfully. So the first being productivity. After the initial time is spent, there's certainly an increase in productivity from the engineers. There's a bigger commitment and more effort when people feel as though the time and energy is being spent on the team. They feel good about putting in that same sort of energy, and then thinking about the bottom line, right? And what that can get affected on good engineering onboarding on an average of 147%. And so when thinking about keys to success, which I'm sure Wambui and James will go through at a certain extent, what are those? So, when you think about documentation, you think about communication, and then team best practices. So documentation, including, code-based documentation, development processes. When you think about communication, when you're not in the same office and you can't have that same water cooler talk, being mindful about, how communication is dealt with in the team. And then, of course, team best practices. So, having systems access, identity and intro to key stakeholders, and of course, clearly defining expectations. And, we'll dig into these in greater detail throughout the presentation. But coming into our first topic is, prepping before day one. So, a successful new hire onboarding starts with prep, and it makes sense for us to start our discussion there with James and Wambui. So diving right into that, what are the things that leaders should be thinking about to prep for their new hires day one? And so, James, how about we start with you? What are some of the things that you're thinking about when prepping for day one of a new hire?
Sure, yeah. The term that comes to mind for me when I think about remote onboarding is out of sight, out of mind. This is what we need to combat right now. We're all remote. It's difficult enough for existing folks to connect with each other, but for those people who are new, it's especially tough. And if you think about a time when you were new to a company, I'm sure we've all got good and bad memories about that. But I remember being a brand new engineer. I was pretty junior in London. It was a particular job, and no one was expecting me. There was no desk. There was no one to greet me. I felt lonely, isolated for some time, and I was actually on site. This wasn't a remote situation, so. If we think about people being remote and combining that with that kind of scenario, it's really, really challenging. And we're not going to get the best out of people if we have people struggling when they join us. So, and I've also had great experience that I've learned from as well along the way. But for me, what I'm thinking about is creating the right nurturing environment for new folk. I think that's key. We want the new person to feel welcome and at ease with their new team members. And the earlier we can do that, the better. So, the first thing I'd say is don't leave everything to HR. It's really important to build that relationship as a manager early and help set this person up for success. And make sure the equipment's ready. Obviously, that's kind of the foundational stuff, but so often that goes wrong. And make sure that there's a buddy ready and talk to them. Talk to the buddy. Make sure that they're ready to welcome this new person. And it's not, we don't want to have that element of surprise around, or for people to feel as though there's a surprise when they join. And things to think about: creating a checklist for the new person, And I think one thing I'd like to emphasize is that I think quite often there's a lot of tendency for people to think, well, the new person needs to introduce themselves. But I think that they're the least comfortable. And I think it's important to put the onus on the existing team to make sure that they're ready to introduce themselves to that new person joining, so they have that great experience. So everyone should know their name, who they are, their background, ready to welcome them, and make sure that everyone has introductions ready and has that empathy for being new, so they have a really warm welcome. And I set the explicit expectation with the team that they should check in regularly, ask questions, spend time screen sharing with the new joiner, and doing interactive real-time sessions. So, having that kind of environment for the new team member, I think, is really important.
Awesome. Thanks, James. And yeah, you mentioned a few things that resonate really well with me. Feeling lonely on the first day is definitely something I've been through in previous times where I've been sort of new. So that makes total sense. Wambui, looking at it from a different lens. So one, would you add anything to what James mentioned? And then two, would you change your approach at all when thinking about bringing on a whole team of engineers to start as opposed to just one person?
Sure. And I think, first and foremost, just kudos to James, because I know that the way that he's approached just setting up and preparing for Andela engineers certainly is a great example of how how individual and team leaders should be doing it. I think in the context of team, so whether it's you're bringing on an entire team or you're bringing on a team that's going to be dispersed amongst several teams, what we found to be really critical is identifying the champions, whether it's champions on the remote team side or champions, but very importantly, champions on the receiving team side. This is the person who has to set the tone and expectations of what success looks like for the one team, as well as ensure that there's consistency in the onboarding plan. So how is James thinking about it for his growth team versus how other managers might be thinking about it for their teams, and ensure that that success criteria is consistent across all those teams, including what needs to get done ahead of time, so that the people who are joining the team feel received. And then also always thinking about, there's things that you can easily walk over to somebody to seek out. But when it's a remote team and you've got teams across multiple teams, how do you make it much easier for them to find things? And so I think the champion's really important. And they don't have to be involved in all activities, but they certainly have to be able to hold all team leaders accountable for the success of the process. That'll be really important. And that champion has to be, must be empowered and responsive.
That makes total sense. Big believer in the champion, especially for ongoing success. On that same note, Wambui, how has onboarding or preparing for day one evolved over time when thinking about now everyone being remote?
Sure. A lot, and I think in really good ways. So I think today onboarding across remote teams has really changed in sort of how we're driving better outcomes for the whole team as a team. It's less the way I did it when I was much younger, which was ensuring that I left no I without a dot and not a single T without a cross in a functional spec that then got thrown over the virtual wall, and then making sure that the remote team had access to the necessary systems. Today, I think it's a little bit more about sort of how are we making sure that we have a plan in terms of how we're going to invest in forming and norming of the one team, whether it's the co-located team with remote team members, whatever the makeup might be. And it does require some time and investment in building towards what you had referred to earlier, the trust and team empowerment, a really critical ingredient to sort of what successful onboarding should look like today.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So now we should all feel accomplished. We've prepared for the first day. We have prepared for the first week. So I think that's a good transition into what's important to you when you think about the new hires' entire first week's schedule? So James, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think, overall, just continuing from what I said, make sure they get a great impression. And I think another thing that can happen is it can be very overwhelming, right? The first week can be incredibly overwhelming for people. So I think that being mindful of that and pacing the information, I like to make sure that I'm putting an emphasis on, spending the first week getting to know the rest of the team, setting up time, having a bit of fun, bonding, coming up with a task that's a quick win, I think is really good. Something simple so that people can understand the workflow easily without having to do anything too challenging. Setting up some regular check-ins, both with the buddy and with the manager. And on day one, I think it's really important to have that one-on-one, the manager to have the one-on-one with the new person and set a few expectations. And the kind of conversation I try to have is more around helping the person realize that there aren't any silly questions. I say that, be curious. It's very likely that that new person, if they're puzzled by an acronym or something that seems confusing, usually other people are feeling it, but they've just got used to it, used to some of these things that are confusing on the team. I also recommend that they update the team channel with thoughts, ideas, questions, pictures, and reply to others, react, be social. And the earlier people do that, the earlier people get involved in team channels and are reacting to things. If they err on the side of over communication, I emphasize if they do that, they'll get to know everyone faster and people will respond and be more available to them because they'll know they're there. Be bold and adventurous. That's something else that I tell people, and I encourage them to contribute ideas and thoughts during team sessions because that's a great way to find out how they're learning, what they're learning, and just get on Slack or Zoom calls regularly with people. Pair up, solve problems, screen share, join in the socials, take part. I think that's the message that I'll send to someone in their first one-on-one, just to ensure they know they've got permission, right, to do these things. Because I think setting the right tone as a manager of engagement and being involved and early, to me that feels like a very positive thing, and it's something that's worked well.
Thanks, James. I actually think that's a really good transition into the next question, James. So, you mentioned, the existing sort of engineers already knowing, what to do, where to Slack, sort of being more communicative. How do you integrate, sort of those same rituals and expectations in a remote setting? I feel like, when you're in person, from previous experiences, you sort of see what other people are doing, right, in a live setting. But how do you implement those things remotely?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things I've done. I've tried to, the absence of not being able to see people, I try to visualize the team. I'll put, pictures of people and roles and stakeholders on a slide and say, okay, these are all the people in the team and the people you interact with. Because I think that, we think visually, and having that view of the team makes it much easier than just kind of looking at a list in Slack or whatever. I think the other thing is having information super easy to discover and well organized. Being remote, I think, it usually forces people to get a lot more organized around that, because you can't just go over to someone and ask questions. And having team information on a wiki or reference from it, keep it up to date and simple. And, one of the anti-patterns that comes up a lot is a lot of Google Docs that are shared with individuals, and they're great for collaboration. I'm not knocking Google Docs, but I think unless they're actually indexed and organized, that results in a ton of siloed knowledge. So fostering that culture of sharing written information publicly in an organized way, rather than direct messages. The same with the code documentation. There's lots of best practice around that. So I think that this isn't specific necessarily to onboarding, but I think having the right setup and environment, and that mindset that the information isn't that valuable unless it's really shared with everyone is really important to set. The other thing we do is we make sure that everyone joins a boot camp at Coursera. We used to do this in a classroom style, but now everything's online, like our content. So new engineers can go through it at their own pace. And we make it really easy for new joiners to ask questions in Slack, so they can turn to their buddy as well. And I've been checking in on this. We've been getting really good feedback from this. Classroom sessions can be overwhelming, and especially if they're online. So I think having things on demand, information on demand, where people can learn at their own pace what they need, because they might not need everything at once. So that's worked really well. And then I think the other thing is encouraging online pairing on tasks, rotating that amongst engineers, so people get an opportunity, they have the space to ask questions in a way that's safe and easy. Speaking up in big meetings can be quite intimidating for new people, or a lot of people don't like that. So having different forums that people can ask questions is I think is really important. And online bonding, online interactions, we set up a number of things. We try and have, it's difficult sometimes to remember to do these things, but I don't think you can underestimate the value of having online social sessions when we can't do happy hours in person. So having online games, or we tried an exercise where everyone shared a slide about their life now they're remote, what they've learned about themselves, what they want to do when things open up again, and it just results in so much rapport and the ability for people to then approach people about problems and questions if they feel like they know a bit more about someone. Another thing, I'm listing quite a lot here, but we've tried so many things. Another thing is Zoom drop-ins, or whichever conferencing tool you use. We have a breakfast drop-in session, make it unstructured so people can just come along, ask questions. It doesn't need to be everyone there. And, like having a bit more time around Q&A, I think is important as well, because information in all hands can be overwhelming. And if you only have 5 minutes at the end for Q&A, it's not really giving a lot of interaction. So activities that are interactive and involve everyone being engaged in sessions, I think lead to much better outcomes when people are remote than a one-way conversation.
Yeah,
so,
a lot of things.
Yeah,
a lot of things resonate with me there.
There's actually one other thing I wanted to add. Right, I think the other thing I wanted to say is that from a diversity and inclusion point of view, we talk, sometimes people talk about culture fit, and I think it's really important to talk about culture add with new people and make sure that we're remembering that someone who's new is going to be adding to the culture and team norms and adding to the way you work. So, we need to be thinking about that. And new people offer incredible insights as well. At Coursera, we teach, we have courses worldwide, education worldwide, and remote team members from Andela or elsewhere in the world can provide really good insights back to us as well. So the diversity and inclusion part of it is something as well that I think is important to think about with the way that we approach onboarding, so that it's more of an addition to what you're doing rather than fit in.
Yeah, big believer in the diversity aspect, obviously, and I think that's ultra important. And then a couple other things resonated with me. Number one, I'd like to see the statistic of how many more Google Docs are on the planet right now with being remote. And then, also you mentioned remote collaborative sessions. We're actually doing one with our team, virtual escape the room. And so I'm a big believer, just because we can't do things in person. There's lots of great opportunities to interact and problem solve and team build together. Wambui, anything you would add, and anything that we're missing?
Not really. I think James covered a lot. And to be honest, I think just really commending Coursera and James. I think maybe as a learning organization, they continue to want to learn and to evolve and to iterate in terms of what it means to be able to create the team in a way that they can be productive. But super impressed with sort of the practical applications of how you sort of can focus and invest in those softer sides of, I guess, the integration of the team. I think if I could, maybe I'd just double click on oftentimes, because Andela works with sort of a truly diverse group of partners. We call them partners. And some may skew more towards just the push to productivity. And I think that it is important to be able to think about the things that James has spoken about in terms of how you're creating that sense of team. And I often push that I actually believe communication is probably the stronger indicator that integration is happening, more so than maybe the first submission of even really great code. Because I think that's sort of what becomes a sustaining glue for whether the team is actually doing really well and how often are they escalating through maybe their team leads as opposed to talking to each other. So whatever you can do to reduce that friction and enhance the communication, especially since the teams are remote, truly will give you longer term results. But I think James's list was awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Thanks, Wambui. Moving on to a success framework and essentially measuring the progress. As an engineering leader, you want to be able to measure your new hires' performance, and that obviously ranges on how you do that. Starts with goal setting and different success frameworks. So let's sort of unwrap that. So this is sort of a example, and without going into too much detail, examples of a success framework over 7, 30, and 90-day periods. And obviously setting expectations and communicating them early is ultra important. And no matter what framework you use and what framework you design, it's important that the new hire knows the right expectations over the first few months. So, jumping right in, Wambui, what are the typical feedback loops that you usually like to incorporate to measure success and make sure the right expectations are being placed?
So they sort of are the obvious one, sort of how are you setting up? And I think the checklist oftentimes for most companies, they sort of are really, really good about the 7-day one. And then by the time you get to 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days, it starts to sort of peter off. And so the feedback loops are important, and you have to think about them across the full 90 days, even though you might find team success even before the 90 days. And I think it has to go in multiple ways. There's the feedback from the receiving team, sort of the team that has been in existence prior to this remote onboarding, whether an individual or a team. And where are you allowing them to create the feedback and really pushing for it to be direct? And then how are you creating the checkpoints? This could be some of the rituals that come with your agile developments, whether it's the retro, and then understanding what can be better and always asking, how can we iterate? How can we be thinking about this differently to make sure that there's less friction between the teams that ultimately have to deliver? And so oftentimes I think that will either be a retro over a Zoom call, let's say, polls within a Slack channel, but however it is, you can collect it and then actually track it. I know we'll be talking about monitoring and sort of how do you identify success of an onboarding. But I think how you track it over time will also be important because it begins to also show the team how they've evolved.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think tracking it over time is something I've heard time and time again is ultra important, and people are always trying to sort of find what best practices are there. James, what about you? Any feedback loops that you like to incorporate?
Yeah, I mean, +1 on the challenge around remembering to check back in, right? I totally agree with what Wambui said there. It can be very easy to just, start off on the right footing and then forget that even at, 2 months in, 6 months in, being new is challenging, and I still feel new wherever I am. So I think making sure that we refresh on the goals is very important. We use OKRs, we set them each quarter, and I try to make sure that there are individual OKRs set early for team members, especially with being remote, and have that conversation early, have regular one-on-ones. They're critically important. And I think there's stuff that you can find out in a less structured way as well, through coaching questions and listening. Things it's amazing what can arise when you're disciplined about following that coaching style and just remembering that, okay, when I stop talking, lots of insights come up. The other thing we do is engagement surveys. At Coursera, we did a dedicated remote onboarding engagement survey not long after we went remote, which was completely anonymous, so people were able to share how they were feeling about things. And I think that's a very, very good tool to use. And the other thing I'd say is, as a manager, being visible, available, friendly. We used to talk about management by walking around. It's you want to be able to find ways of doing that without being, without appearing to be intruding, right? So I think being available, participating appropriately in Slack conversations, in open forums, and letting people know that you have an open door policy, and make sure that there's a way to have that open door, that you're available, that people can approach you. Because observing these interactions, as well as hearing from things in an unstructured way, is another form of getting that feedback from people that they might not offer otherwise. So trust, psychological safety comes up for me, making sure that you build that environment where I show vulnerability and share things where I've made mistakes, and that helps other people. It sets the example for other people to be able to share things that maybe they're not happy with as well. And it's really hard to do that. But I think that Q&A sessions at the end of meetings can be good, but one-on-ones where you have that trust can be incredibly good for finding out how people are getting on.
And I think if I can add, I know James, we'd mentioned it when we were sort of speaking about today's webinar, but it was like reading the Zoom, which is also another unstructured way of getting a better sense of how are people showing up. Are they putting on their videos? Are they engaging? Are they participating? Which I think is also another sort of really good way to get a better sense of how people are doing.
Awesome.
Awesome. So on that same note, Wambui, obviously monitoring and tracking success, which we were just talking about, has evolved. And, I think both of you mentioned sort of, previously being able to walk around offices and do brief check-ins. How has that evolved over time? And what is maybe one or two different approaches you take today in a remote setting to do that?
Sure. So I think a lot of what James and I have spoken about is this sort of what is the path? The path to success is, by all means, the team's working well and your new team members are able to be productive, right? But I think what actually creates the success for the team ongoing and for the long term is how you get to trust and empowerment. And I know, Pervez, you'd mentioned it earlier. And I think it's really sort of that sense of empowerment will come with integration. So how are the teams dancing together? How are they showing up on their Zoom calls? What's the chatter that's happening on Slack? I love the expression of sort of how are the new team members providing culture add. But productivity remains a really important one. And that's how frequently are you evaluating how your engineers are receiving clear instruction, are able to have the feedback loops that allows them to seek clarity when clarity is not available, and then how are they ultimately producing quality deliverables? So that's another really important way of just getting a better sense of how has the team moved from orientation to actual productivity and team norming. And to succeed, I think truly what has to be, set up well and then monitored as a joint responsibility is the trust in the process that has been outlined before onboarding. If the teams are not sold in the process, then generally it doesn't really matter what you're attempting to monitor because they're not really vested in that process, and that sort of increases some of that friction. So I think that those are some of the things that are a little bit more softer, because certainly you can look at using tools, you can get a better sense of their velocity and you can get a better sense of the quality of the code, all very good indicators. But how are you ultimately sort of finding the markers that are trust and empowerment for your team?
Thanks, Wambui. I want to go into one last question before we open it up for Q&A and make sure everyone has an opportunity to ask questions. And it's my favorite question. And this should sort of give you an opportunity to wrap all the things we've talked about into one. But what is the most important thing when you think about a successful remote onboarding? And it could be important thing or things that you consider. But Wambui, let's start with you on this one, and then we'd love to hear from James as well on this.
Okay. I think from my experiences with over 200 teams that we've had to place Andela engineers, I cannot stress enough the importance of having an engaged champion who's both empowered and responsive. I think James is a good example, but it helps set the tone for what successful onboarding looks like. And ultimately, the proof in the pudding is when your remote team evolves beyond the champion and are independently proactive, but also proactively engaging in your team's culture enhancing activities to sort of begin to really feel and present as one team. But most important is that engaged champion.
Thanks, Wambui. James?
Yeah, so I think for me, the most important thing that leads to success is that supportive, welcoming team that hasn't forgotten what it's like to be new and acts in a way that supports that new person and realizes that it's okay to slow down a bit to help a new person to speed up. And I think that it's the same, with any kind of scaling, that there is a tax associated with bringing in new people, and everyone needs to be behind that. The fact that new people need to, we need to have new people joining, and it's everyone's job to make that work. So I think scaling the onboarding across the team, to me, is what's important. So it doesn't all fall on one person. But also, I totally agree with the, with Wambui's take as well on having the champion to help foster that culture and environment so that new people can join seamlessly and quickly be productive and understand how things work, so that they can do their best work and enjoy and feel engaged.
Awesome. Thank you both. And real quick, before we get into Q&A, a little bit about Andela and what we do, since that's been mentioned a few times. We're about 6 years old, and essentially our job is to help engineering leaders essentially scale their teams quickly and cost effectively. And so, we work with over 200 companies, and our engineers essentially join as full-time, fully embedded members of their team. So besides just that, we consider ourselves experts in remote engineering best practices. And so we're always happy to share information and just have a conversation around what we've seen be successful throughout different partnerships. So let's dive right into Q&A.
Pervez, thank you very much. So great presentation, guys. Pervez, Wambui, and James. So it looks like you have 4 questions. I'm not sure, Pervez, maybe you want to hit the first one there.
Sure. So the first question we're seeing is, my company is in the med tech space, and we are growing faster than ever now. Should we hire and onboard developers in waves, or have them all start on the same day? Wambui, James?
Sure, I can probably take it, and then maybe James have you add on. I think the answer to that question really lies in what is the team you have to support the onboarding of the new developers? And so to what extent do you have enough of your team able to be buddies and to be able to do the paired programming and to do the shadowing and to do the welcoming? Because you also don't want to spread them too thin, because that's also going to it's going to decrease their productivity, even as they are bringing on team members. So I think the way that we generally will advise some of our partners is really looking at where do you need and where does your roadmap need the most amount of productivity or team integration? What new teams are you starting to launch? And it makes sense for those teams to launch together. versus which ones are looking to be enhanced and scaled. And to that extent is how do you sort of think about the productivity of those team members in relation to their ability to truly be vested in the success of your new teams. So I'm sort of, I guess, answering with a bunch of things for you to think about, but I think it's just really more sort of what is your team and what is their availability and how does that potentially impact your ability to produce, given how you might be stretching them based on the number of engineers you're bringing on. James, what would you add?
I think having a plan around what they're going to be doing and who they're going to be working with is key as well. So, the support for the engineers is important, but also have they got, are there enough product managers? Are there enough, if you have dedicated QA, are you scaling up QA as well? Plus managers, if you're scaling up dramatically and you're not increasing the number of engineering managers in parallel with the engineering onboarding, then I think you're likely to run into problems. But making sure there's enough work for them as well. That's why I mentioned product management, because you don't want new engineers to be joining and not having the right input to be able to have them be successful. So I think there's a lot of other things to unpack here, but that's something that comes to mind for me.
Thanks. On that same note, have you noticed any sort of difference when onboarding, essentially, call it senior engineers versus junior engineers? James, I see you smiling on this one, so maybe we can start with you.
I think that when we're talking about remote working, my observation is it's much harder for junior engineers to onboard remotely. And I think there are a number of companies that have made decisions around which level to have people completely remote. I think it's different if there's an office in another location with a number of people, but being completely remote can be challenging. But you can also make it work, right? I mean, we've been bringing on board new junior engineers. I think there is more of an overhead because the engineers just haven't got the level of experience that a senior engineer will have in how to work and some of the foundational things that within being part of an engineering team. So I think that the important point here is that take into account the extra work that it takes to really make junior engineers successful and give them that support network they need to be able to ramp up and learn and feel part of something and understand how to work.
And I think one thing I'd add, we certainly have had a lot of lessons learned on how to enable and launch junior engineers, is James is absolutely right. Sort of the support that is required is more, and sort of time to being able to be productive also has to be factored. But the way some teams have been able to overcome that is sort of the sense of a pod. So with every X number of juniors, sort of how can you sort of attach a senior alongside them to be able to provide the support and provide the coaching, the more active coaching. Because when it is really, truly remote, the junior engineer does still require those things. If you think back to the way we all grew up as engineers, but identifying sort of ways that you can reduce that ratio in a way that gives them access to a senior engineer that they can learn from and be coached by.
Awesome. Thanks. We actually have a few questions on this topic, but what is the best way to handle shadowing, or call it paired programming, when engineers are remote, and how can they sort of learn from each other in that sort of environment? Wambui?
Sure. So I think we've tried a little bit of everything. And certainly there are ways that you can have just sort of for the time that they're going to be overlapping and actually doing their paired programming, having their screens on and to sort of having an ongoing and active, whether it's a Zoom call. I think there's sort of tools that allow you to sort of see each other's screens. But it's also sort of trying to make sure that you are making clear sort of what those rituals are. So are they creating a sense of accountability around who's driving, who's watching, and so on? And what does that then look like? Because it is easy when you're remote, when you're physically together and you sort of have the same screens, to replicate that virtually is not always as easy, especially if there isn't really the discipline. And so I know that there's a lot of benefit in being able to have it be paired. And I think that there are many ways. And so how we sort of even more provide enough screens for our remote engineers to make sure that they're able to be productive while going through their paired sessions. But clarity and the expectations of what should come out of those paired sessions is really critical. James, I'm not too sure, like, what are you using paired programming at all?
Yeah, the team have been really enjoying it, actually. And, I'd say I agree totally. I think, it comes back to the whole how people work effectively together and building, having emotional intelligence and building the trust so that people can then have honest conversations about things that aren't working, are working. And I think, just to echo Wambui, I think having norms and agreeing them together as a team is key, because when I've done pair programming, I did it for a year in person, and sitting next to someone all day can be quite a challenge if people are distracted and they're on their phone, or you haven't agreed what the norms are, and breaks, like having a break, and all of these things are really important when it comes to pair programming. It's intense. But it is a great way to learn. So I highly recommend, trying it and iterating on what works for you, because what works for one organization or team or person may not work for someone else. I think that's kind of the key to a lot of things. There isn't a right or wrong. There's a situational agreement between the two people pairing. And then a team, there'll be a team norm as well around things. So spending the time thinking about having that meta, how are we doing this? Is it working? Coming back to retros and talking about it as well. I think that's key to this kind of very intense style that does reap benefits when you do it, especially remotely. And the technology is there. I think one thing I'd add is that it's also, in addition to pair programming, when everyone's remote, you need to work on pair designing as well, and pair reviewing and all of these things. And one of the things we found really great is if someone makes a short video and shares that, uploads it, and talks to it, and so when someone does a code review, share that video, and then it gives so much extra context to what someone's being asked to review or look at. And they don't need to be on a Zoom to do that, so it's so easy to make short videos of screens and things like that, share them, and it just gives other people a lot of more insight into what you've been working on and why, and those kind of questions as well. So that's something I like.
Thanks. So I find this one interesting. This is 3 questions in one, but all completely related. But how do you measure effective onboarding for individuals when it relates to productivity? And then how do you know your program is actually yielding results? And what do you continuously measure and reiterate on?
James, why don't you start? James, go ahead.
So, we're using Scrum. We see velocity. We can see productivity through that. I mentioned we use OKRs, and we have goals, individual OKRs and team OKRs as well. And, doing those every quarter, checking back in on results. And also, I think that ultimately, if we set targets and then we're aiming for them, we check back in on them, and then if we don't make them, we need to adapt something. So, I think there are many different ways to measure productivity, but ultimately, if we're setting OKRs and goals around targets, especially with, I'm on a growth team, so we're looking at numbers of registrations and other things as well, and those are the goals that we're heading for. So, checking back in on those, and then as we add new team members, seeing if there's any impact on those numbers, and then adjusting accordingly. Because ultimately, the onboarding process is to help us all, scale and be able to do more.
And I think if I can maybe answer the question on sort of how do you decide what to measure and iterate on, it's also understanding, going back to what I was saying earlier around communication. What about those feedback loops was broken in terms of why the velocity was low or why the quality was low? Because oftentimes, hopefully everyone's a really good person and they're being honest and there's integrity and persistence in how they're attempting to solve problems. But perhaps what was the blocker that caused them to either not be able to deliver well? Or what was the reason why perhaps their PR was not reviewed in the time that was expected? So there's sort of very human things that could be happening that could explain what is not working as well. And that might be the thing that ends up having to be iterated on, though you still have your expectations on your OKRs and your velocity. So it's how are you making sure that you're sort of digging a little bit deeper to get a better sense of what was blocking the ability to meet those metrics.
Awesome. I have a pretty relevant question for both of you. Wambui, I know you hit on this a little bit earlier when you were giving your intro, but what about for global companies? So, companies that have engineers and essentially product and delivery teams throughout the world, how do you ensure the onboarding experience is essentially the same for all new hires?
So as close as possible to what is the one team, and then ensuring that team is as vested in the process of bringing on all the remote engineers. We have partners where the entire team is remote, and they often actually more expert in how it is to bring on more remote engineers. And what I've seen for those types of partnerships and those types of engagements, the obsession around how are we now feeling like you are part and you are one of us? How are we embedding you into our rituals and our practices? How are we seeking feedback? What I call the softer side of integration is emphasized even more. And I think where we've seen integration really be quite poor is when it's like the team in India, the team in Nigeria, the team when you start to create sort of even those borders around remote teams, it starts to create friction about, well, are they our team? Are we a team? And so it's really how you sort of make it feel. And sort of it's the same rules. If any one person's remote, everybody must be practicing the same ways of being a team member and being engaged. But I don't know, James, I know you also have several remote teams. How do you think about it in the context of global?
I mean, I think now we're all working remote. We're thinking differently about this a lot of the time. I mean, personally, I agree. I think having a team that's made up of individuals from different backgrounds and different parts of the world and working on having that work leads to benefits because we have different ideas and perspectives and ways of looking at things. And I think the balance is important. I mean, sometimes it may not be appropriate to have a very distributed team when you want to get something done, and it's helpful if everyone's in the same time zone. But there are lots of benefits with having people in different time zones as well. So from a support and answering questions and being able to do things in different time zones, especially if you've got customers in different areas of the globe as well. The team is able to hand off to each other and be flexible. But it's not one rule for everyone. I think you have to weigh up what your needs are and then see what fits with the distribution of the people.
And Pervez,
Awesome.
Pervez, just wanted to say, it looks like you have time for one more question. If you want to give that from Parker Billings a shot.
Yeah. So from Parker, this one is specifically for James. How important is the onboarding process when you are looking for an organization or a vendor to partner with?
Thanks, Parker. Well, I think it's key whatever you're doing. Being intentional and thinking about onboarding is key. I mean, I take it, having worked with a lot of different vendors across different locations, I do take a pretty active role in not only the onboarding, but also, talking to people before we make a decision to bring them on board. And I partner with the organization and I'll ask, can I talk with the people that you're recommending? So that works well. I've noticed that with Andela particularly, I've learned a lot from Andela as well around onboarding. They've shared with me some of their resources and advice. And I can see that Andela have done a great job of working out how to help people get onboarded through some of the things that we've talked about today. So that's been really helpful. So I haven't needed, I don't feel like I've needed to do as much as I have with some other organizations I've worked with. But yeah, I think it's very important to work on the plan together with the organization.
Terrific. And you know what? We have time for one more minute. So if you want to answer Elaine's question there really quick.
So if we could resume normal, do you recommend a remote team consisting with all remote members of our hybrid team? I think it's what makes sense for the cadence in which you want to be delivering. So for example, if you do go back to normal and the product team is all co-located and you've got engineers who are remote, what does that then mean in terms of how they are integrating? But by all means, I mean, to the extent that your team is feeling super engaged and able to work from home, then it continues to embody some of the best practices that they've learned when they were forced to be remote, given when they are normal. I know for many, some partners have expressed the desire to run hybrid teams only out of sort of those moments of how do we create innovation and how do we, we haven't yet really learned, how do we do brainstorming online really well? I think there's a lot of tools that support it now. But yeah, I'm excited to see more remote, more distributed, because I think it actually adds to the diversity and the success of product teams. I don't know, James, if you have comments around going back to just being all remote.
I know that people are missing the office. Some people are missing it. Some people aren't. I do quite like the idea of going into the office myself now and again. But yeah, I think it's very much an individual choice that companies have to make based on all sorts of factors. And I think you can make either work.
Terrific. Well, thank you guys for wondering if maybe Pervez, you can share your email address for everybody. I'm not sure if it's on one of your slides for the attendees to, if there's any additional questions.
Yeah. For any additional questions, my email is Pervez, so PERVEZ .Soomar SOOMAR at Andela.com. And yeah, if there's any additional questions, we're happy to reach out and answer any of those for you.
And that information will also be included on everybody who's participating today will be getting an email in the next 48 hours, which will have a recorded version of this session, as well as additional contact information if you have additional questions. And then finally, before we finish overall today, I just wanted to thank the Andela team, James Wambui and Pervez for their time and their great content today. And as I noted just a moment ago, within 48 hours, there's going to be a recorded version of this that will be emailed out. A link will be emailed out to the participants. And it will also be available at devnetwork.com as well as developerweek.com in our content archive. So I just want to say thank you to the Andela team as well as to all of our attendee participants. And I want to make sure that everybody has a great and healthy day. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks for having us. Have a good day.